This is Tuvalu. These are Tuvalu's people. And this is their life. The first vulnerability Tuvalu is facing is sea level rise. This is an ecological dimension, and the hazard here is that the ocean is already 4.5 meters over sea level around this island. This can cause a loss in coastal land, which is dangerous for small islands like Tuvalu. This rising sea level will increase coastal erosion, pollution, storm damage, and flooding. This directly affects the people living on the coast and their homes. These rising seas also pose threats to coastal roads, bridges, jetties, docks, piers, and waterfront properties. The second vulnerability deals with Tuvalu's agriculture. This is an economic and cultural dimension. The hazard here is that since sea level is rising, the ground of Tuvalu is becoming contaminated with salinization, which is then threatening the habitats of plants and crops. Puaka and coconut trees are the plants being threatened here because of this increasing salinization. The sensitivity here is that puaka is traditionally a staple food in Tuvalu, and now this dependent crop is in danger.
The third vulnerability Tuvalu is facing is freshwater shortage. This is a cultural dimension. The hazard here is that the islands of Tuvalu over time have lost much of their fresh groundwater resources because of both sea level rise and human pollution. Consequently, Tuvaluans only can rely on rainwater storage. This is becoming a huge concern for Tuvaluans. The fourth vulnerability is risk with coastal adaptation policies. This is a political dimension. Managing the impacts of rising sea levels for communities is being made more difficult by the actions of governments, homeowners, and even some well-intentioned climate adaptation practitioners. In this case, coastal adaptation policies usually carry political risk. The main risk here is when communities end up divided between those wanting a response to the growing risk of coastal flooding and those more concerned about how their own property values or insurance premiums might be hit in the short term by such action. For some, the biggest threat is seen to be from sea level rise adaptation policies rather than sea level rise itself.
The fifth vulnerability is decreased health for Tuvaluans. This is a social dimension. The hazard here is because of an increase in climate change. This increases inundation, tropical cyclones, and higher tides. These climate changes directly affect Tuvaluans. These elements of climate change cause an increase of Tuvaluans with exposed to waterborne diseases and will increase the epidemic potential of the islands.
The sixth vulnerability is diminished fisheries. This is an economic and ecological dimension. Because of rising surface water temperatures, shellfish and available fish resources will greatly decrease. In addition, these rising ocean temperatures will diminish fragile ecosystems of coral and the marine fauna. This will cause a reduction of fish as a resource that is consumed as food. In addition, the biodiversity of the surrounding ocean will decrease. Considering that Tuvaluans, on average, eat 500 grams of fish per capita every day, this could economically hurt Tuvalu. In addition, a decrease in ocean biodiversity will make the ecosystem less productive.
The first opportunity that Tuvalu has to offer because of climate change is increased tourism. This is an economic dimension. Increased temperatures can mean a longer tourism season for the islands of Tuvalu. Longer tourism season can mean more tourists. Increased tourism will economically enhance Tuvalu's business and economy.
The second opportunity that Tuvalu has due to climate change is CO2 benefiting vegetation. This is an ecological and economic dimension. An increase in CO2 can increase the life and quality of vegetation and crops in Tuvalu. This exposes farmers that sell the crop they grow and Tuvaluans that live off of their crops. Better crops can lead to an increase in the quality of life and an increase in economic profits.
The history of Tuvalu's economy is very extensive. First, throughout history, Tuvaluans used the land to live and had no set economy where money was exchanged. Tuvaluans instead used goods to barter. Tuvalu was discovered by a Spanish voyage ship and was eventually controlled under the sphere of British influence. Foreign countries also began using Tuvalu for their natural resources because of imperial controls. Tuvalu mainly earned money through these natural resources like whale meat and blubber, and they also traded many goods. After the Industrial Revolution, trading on the island deferred, and supercargo ships went directly to the islanders for goods from the island. Many Tuvaluans earn wages through shipping jobs and send the money back home to their families. All in all, Tuvalu is a poor country with lots of the country's money coming from national aid.
Tuvalu has never been an industrial superpower, and the country is still developing currently, so the carbon footprint of Tuvalu has always been minimal when compared to industrial countries like the United States. Tuvalu's CO2 emissions are negligible, and the country plans to have 100% clean energy by the year 2020. With the exception of shipping, Tuvaluans' jobs and lifestyles cause a small carbon footprint.
33.3% of Tuvalu is covered by forests. Deforestation is rare and uncommon in Tuvalu. There has been no reported change in the percent of covered forest area in Tuvalu from the year 1990 to currently.
About 96% of Tuvaluans are ethnic Polynesian. The population of Tuvalu is 9,876 people. 97% of Tuvaluans are Congregationalists. Tuvaluans adapt to the changing environment around them in order to survive. The threat of global warming in Tuvalu is not motivation for Tuvaluans to leave because of their strong ties with the island's lifestyle, culture, and identity.
Approximately 15% of Tuvaluans work on merchant ships and work for months on end in order to provide for their family back home. Tuvaluans earn small wages or even no wages and live off of the land through fishing, hunting, and gathering food. Tuvalu's residents are considered very poor, and the income of all Tuvaluans are overall low.
Women in Tuvalu often fulfill the caretaker position in their homes and use the land's resources for food, water, and care for their homes. The changing environment and the effects from drought, rising sea level, etc. make it more difficult for women to complete their everyday tasks to take care of their family. Women are forced to adapt to the changing environment of the island in order to support their families.
Elderly people have heightened vulnerability against climate change due to decreased mobility. Individuals who suffer from pre-existing chronic diseases, who take medications or have little to no mobility are more vulnerable against heat, pollutants, and various diseases.
The indigenous people of Tuvalu live off the natural resources in their land, and climate change has a huge impact on their resources, which will force them to adapt to a new way of living. The rising sea level in Tuvalu is truly the root of all of the indigenous people's problems that have to do with climate change. Other than a small number of expatriate workers, there are few migrants in Tuvalu and no minority populations. There has been substantial migration to the main island, Funafuti, where half the population now lives, and recent immigration, especially to New Zealand.
When climate changes, food becomes more scarce because of the difficulty to grow crops, so food prices soar and the poor people don't have resources to obtain the food. Because of the diseases that could be in the air, it can negatively impact health, and poor people may not have sufficient resources to aid in their recovery.
Tuvalu has many trade-offs. As a pro, they could choose to relocate, but as a con, they would lose their nation and ties to the island. Another pro could be staying on the island. However, Tuvalu will eventually become extinct due to sea level rise. A third pro is that Tuvalu could industrialize their nation to earn money for clean energy. However, industrialization can lead to deforestation and even more greenhouse gas emissions. A fourth trade-off includes Tuvalu asking for foreign aid. A downside to this would be leading to less independence for their nation and less control overall. Finally, Tuvalu could set limits to tourism, and this decreases travel fumes and contains less tourist emissions. However, the lack of tourism could have a negative impact on Tuvalu's economy.
Tuvalu is an island nation that emits small amounts of greenhouse gases and has an insignificant carbon footprint, but the country is at risk of extinction due to climate change. Tuvalu wants legally binding cuts on the carbon emissions of developed and developing countries. Tuvalu blames superpowers like the United States and China for their substantial amounts of carbon emissions and wants the responsible countries to take the necessary measures to fix their negative impact on the environment. Tuvalu does not consider the possible negative effects on a country's economy a sufficient reason to limit action against climate change. Tuvalu pleads other countries implement extreme changes and quickly in order to save Tuvalu and other vulnerable countries.
Tuvalu is the world's second lowest lying country, and sea level rise poses a fundamental risk to its very existence. Climate change, through rising temperatures and irregular rainfall, are already impacting on livelihoods. Tuvalu was officially approved into the UNFCCC on October 26, 1993. Tuvalu has repeatedly rejected climate change plans at COPs and conferences that the country did not view as strict enough in cutting CO2 emissions or as substantial in combating climate change. Tuvalu has always pushed for huge steps to be taken in response to climate change, and Tuvalu has submitted their own climate action plan when they did not feel the conference was succeeding in theirs.
The first instance took place in Bali in 2007, where Tuvalu submitted an international blueprint on adaptation. The International Blueprint on Adaptation was intended to allocate funds to the countries most affected by climate change, acknowledge that the major greenhouse gas emitting countries have an obligation to the vulnerable countries that are affected by climate change, to provide a coordinated international response to the impacts of climate change, and lastly, to provide the necessary tools to assess the impacts of climate change.
The second instance took place in Copenhagen in 2009. Tuvalu proposed a new Copenhagen Protocol that would be legally binding and would run concurrently with the pre-existing Kyoto Protocol. Tuvalu wanted the rise in the global average temperature to be limited to 1.5 degrees Celsius and for greenhouse gas concentrations to be stabilized at 350 parts per million. After Tuvalu's proposal was tabled for discussion, Tuvalu led a walkout with other small and vulnerable countries.
The third instance took place in 2009, where Tuvalu submitted a paper about issues of indigenous people and the many effects of climate change. This paper discussed the option of limiting deforestation and forest degradation in developing countries. Tuvalu ultimately wanted to protect the land of indigenous people and sustain the management of forests. The fourth instance took place in Durban in 2011. Here, Tuvalu experienced a drought for 2 months before this COP, and the representatives for the small country cited the drought repeatedly as evidence of the negative impacts of climate change in their country. Tuvalu wanted a legally binding agreement for emission targets to be created at the COP. Tuvalu aspired to put the Green Climate Fund into use so that small developing islands could receive funds in order to carry out adaptation work on the ground due to the effects of climate change.
The fifth instance took place in Peru in 2014. Tuvalu called for an expedited process of funding when it comes to accessing money for climate change activities. Tuvalu strongly encouraged the Global Environment Facility to revise its policies so they can gain direct access to the Least Developed Countries Fund. Tuvalu is working towards mitigating climate change and developing an energy sector policy that ensures Tuvalu will be using 100% green energy by the year 2020. Tuvalu experienced issues with accessing funding from the Least Developed Countries Fund under the GEF.
In the current COP in Paris, Tuvalu has much to say about the negotiations. The Prime Minister, named Anil Sopaga, said the negotiations at the COP were painfully slow and went on to accuse larger countries, naming the US and the European Union, of employing delaying tactics. Sopaga quoted, "Access to climate funding has now been taken over by bureaucrats. When we submit our applications, we are told to provide scientific proof that we are being impacted by the effects of climate change. How can a small country like Tuvalu that does not have a good scientific capacity meet that kind of demand?" In addition, the government of Tuvalu launched its new Climate Action Plan, which was submitted to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change in Paris. This climate action plan is called the Intended Nationally Determined Contribution, or the INDC, which comes ahead of negotiations on a new Universal Climate Change Pact to be reached at the 21st UN Climate Conference of the Parties in Paris.
In continuation, at the Paris COP, Sopaga said, Tuvalu's emissions of global greenhouse gases at less than 0.000005% are one of the smallest from any country. In submitting such an ambitious target, Tuvalu wants to show that they are playing our part in the collective response to climate change. This puts us on a strong path to a decarbonized economy. In addition, the Prime Minister of Tuvalu recently said he is very pleased with the outcomes of climate change in Paris, saying those criticizing the deal are misinformed. Sopaga and other negotiators at the conference were able to seal a legally binding agreement that sees the best possible agreement for everyone. The conclusion of the conference was to keep a global temperature rise this century well below 2 degrees Celsius, and to drive efforts to limit the temperature increase even further to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Sopaga believes that this agreement is very significant and that it is a very good pathway to ensure protection and insurance coverage for vulnerable Pacific nations like Tuvalu.
This is the time, Excellencies. We must all stand together and reshape our future. A new comprehensive treaty that will save humanity, the future of mankind. Let's do it for Tuvalu. For if we save Tuvalu, we will surely save the world. Thank you very much.
Rising Tide believes that short-term fixes will pave the way to long-term solutions if developed countries are willing to work with vulnerable countries like Tuvalu. We believe that levees installed on the shores of Tuvalu could also provide Tuvalu's soil enough time to recover from all the salt damage due to the rising sea levels. This will economically benefit Tuvalu because this will allow the agriculture to reestablish and raise its crop yield production, which also raise profits. This will politically benefit Tuvalu by closing the gap between the rich and the poor, allowing the government to tax more and create a fund for renewable energy. This will also culturally benefit Tuvalu once the levees are installed by giving vulnerable Tuvaluans a gateway back to their way of life and establishing the culture lost by the rise in sea level.
To further our recommendation, Rising Tide believes that in all areas of industry that take place in Tuvalu, adding newer and greener technology will help replace higher pollution causing technology. In summary, solutions to climate change require interdisciplinary and multidimensional tools, whether the solution is adaptation, mitigation, or geoengineering.
Following the Paris COP, Tuvalu should continue to push for extreme measures to be taken against climate change and call for drastic reductions of greenhouse gas emissions. They should also demand legally binding agreements of all countries involved in order to hold countries to their promises in regards to reducing their carbon footprint. Last, Tuvalu should keep their promise of having only clean energy by 2020 and also push other countries to commit to green energy.
The installation of levees can help the important shipping industry in Tuvalu thrive, which can lead to an increase in revenues. However, levees will be a very expensive purchase for the poor island, and the money will have to be taken out of other funds in the island. Also, newer and greener technology can lead to cheaper and faster production that will decrease pollution. However, the implementation of green technology is very high in cost, and it is likely that Tuvalu will need aid from foreign countries.
Limiting the tourism industry at Tuvalu has no cost benefits because with a reduced tourism industry, Tuvalu will earn less revenue from tourists. In addition, due to the high cost of our recommendations, Tuvalu will have less money and the country might suffer financially. Tuvaluans may also lose jobs, resulting in many citizens not having the resources that they need.
When talking about Indigenous people, the most important thing is that the culture and history is preserved. Implementing more policies could help Indigenous people mitigate and adapt to climate change, such as developing technologies. When talking about women, we recommend treating women as a homogeneous group, especially in terms of poverty and the environment. Due to the fact that women are more dependent on natural resources for their livelihood and survival, government funding towards the development of the agriculture industry, such as levees, could allow women to live a better life in Tuvalu.
When talking about the poverty-stricken people of Tuvalu, the agricultural industry has the potential to become more developed. The government could then begin to focus on their economic interests involving agriculture and encourage them to use advanced technology to increase their interest. Methods for sustainable agriculture, like water irrigation, levees, and soil treatment, could be put into place to increase crop yield and create more job opportunities. When talking about coastal communities, addressing the additional stress of climate change may require new approaches to managing land, water, waste, and ecosystems, especially in a place like Tuvalu. We recommend that the government construct breakwaters and levees along the lowest lying areas. It is our hope that achieving this short-term goal will lead to the success of long-term goals for these vulnerable coastal communities.
Tuvaluans have always understood they are vulnerable and have an age-old word that empathises with those who have no land.
Whakaalofa, something that felt in your heart. What am I going to do to help these people? Tuvalu is just like that.
Elera es la fanga. Kaya te lalo que le vea maina. Ela hikiro tea. Te fia kai pela te pula mai tea. Te wat fenuane. Pela que fiso so ani mai. Que pula lo fa mai pene. Ha koma wa ke ka pela katolo tea. Te to fenuane. Kati te na e sila.